Hello there, everyone. Just about to get started here. Looks like we have some people in the audience. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. If somebody in the audience could message me to make sure that my audio levels are all right, I would appreciate that. So I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sasha Cisco, and you're listening to the Ultradelic podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. If you feel that the content provided within this podcast is exceptionally enjoyable or exceeds your expectations, well, give this video a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe. That way you can stay up to date on everything that's going on in the psychedelic community. If you'd like to support an independent journalist like me, please feel free to make a heartfelt donation or become a monthly patron over at Patreon. Speaking as a person who is a victim of the war on drugs, it's become especially difficult to make ends meet over the past few years, and especially so given that I've volunteered thousands of hours of work into the psychedelic community proper. That's my cat in the background. Let me let her in. So like I was saying, if you support the work I do, don't be afraid to stop by my Patreon or just as well the other web pages I've linked below. And just as a quick moment of transparency, I want to give thanks to everyone who has provided support in the past. It means the world to me. Without your help, I would not be able to contribute my skill sets and efforts to our broader community. And just to catch everyone up, the first episode of the Ultradelic podcast, Florida Ayahuasca Churches, Religion and Law, that was back in January. And since then, I felt it was necessary to produce this podcast in its entirety. Along with that, one quick second. My apologies for that. But yes, the first episode of the Ultradelic podcast discussed a number of different topics, including the concept of religious freedom, as well as religious freedom laws within the United States, how American courts have interpreted those laws, along with, I also discussed entheogenic churches, such as the União do Vegetal, along with Soul Quest Church of Mother Earth, Church of the Holy Light of the Queen, and a few others. I also discussed Florida's mini RFRA, the various state RFRAs, and liability waivers for entheogenic churches, and I even offered a critique of Chacruna's newly released RFRA guide. Along with that, in case you want to check that episode out, I've actually linked that in the podcast notes below. It's number 1 in the list, just for everyone's convenience. I highly encourage everyone to check that out, but it is not necessary to listen to that podcast in order to enjoy the content within this podcast. Before I get going, I do want to make sure that everyone checks out Cover Story Power Trip. It's a podcast series that's been released by New York Magazine. Along with that, I want to recommend one of Shayla Love's newest articles. It's time to start studying the downside of psychedelics. And given that we'll be discussing the downside of psychedelics tonight, I want to give Shayla and Symposia / New York Magazine a shout out for bringing these issues to the forefront of the modern wave of psychedelic journalism. We need to be able to discuss the dark side of psychedelics with candor and in a self-effacing way. Moving forward, I want to give a quick quote from Shayla. In that article, she said that, quote, to raise concerns about negative outcomes and ethical transgressions is not to be against the psychedelic movement. She's also said that owning up to the fact that a significant minority of people may not have beneficial psychedelic experiences is not the same as being anti-psychedelic or working against the movement. Proving that this community can be accountable and responsible for harms is critical if psychedelic therapy or services are to achieve widespread legalizations or medicalizations. No doubt about it. I am firmly in support of evidence-based research, the highest standards of care for those undergoing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or for those going to psychedelic churches, as well as appropriate regulation and oversight, and above all, ethical behavior. Before we get too deep into the podcast, I have a quick disclaimer for those who are listening. All information that's provided within this podcast does not and is not intended to constitute legal or medical advice. Instead, all content within this podcast is available for general informational purposes only. Just as a warning, this podcast discusses multiple topics that some viewers may find offensive or disturbing. These topics do include, but are not limited to, substance use, organized religion, unethical psychedelic facilitators, and adverse drug reactions. This podcast does not encourage the illicit use of psychoactive substances where they are prohibited by law. This podcast also contains references to other third-party organizations, and such links are only for the convenience of the listener. This podcast will feature photographs and video footage from third-party organizations, and such use clearly falls under the protections of free use. Material in this podcast should not be used as a substitute for personal consultation with appropriate professionals. No individual or organization should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information derived from this podcast. Just as well, this podcast discusses ongoing civil suits, so this podcast may not include the most up-to-date information. Nothing in this podcast should be construed to convey the notion that SoulQuest Church of Mother Earth is not a church. This podcast is not intended to be a RIFRA analysis of SoulQuest, or at least their religious freedom claims, given that other scholars have substantively addressed this topic. Most of the quotes in this podcast that pertain to Chris Young and SoulQuest were obtained from a deposition that Chris Young himself gave in January of 2021. And I've linked that in the show notes below. I believe it's number 12. It's a Google Drive link. Portions of these quotes, this is important, may unfortunately be unintentionally inaccurate because of transcription errors that were beyond my own personal control. Portions of those quotes, I've provided not only the whole of the deposition, but just as well those sections that I'm discussing within the link that I've provided. Final notes in the disclaimer. This podcast cannot offer any extensive background information of the ethnobotanical use and pharmacology of ayahuasca. Please do your own research accordingly. So, what brings us all together today? Arguably the biggest ayahuasca church in the United States is in the middle of a fierce legal battle with the DEA, and in the midst of all this turmoil, SoulQuest is currently engaged in a wrongful death lawsuit with the father of one of their congregants. Former congregants, I should say. Indeed, these are increasingly strange times, and I'm here to try and help make sense of it all. Just to let everyone know, I will continue to report on SoulQuest for the foreseeable future, given the state of their relationship with the DEA. In fact, it was only 3 months ago that I was the first journalist to report on the fact that SoulQuest had settled their lawsuit with Kevin Rupchand. On that note, today's podcast will be dedicated to SoulQuest Church of Mother Earth and everything related to that organization. just to start everything off, give everybody a sense of what Soul Quest is. It's an ayahuasca church that's only a 10-minute drive from the University of Central Florida. Would you look at that? Along with that, well, let me start off here. There's a need to warn others about this particular ayahuasca church. Now that the DEA has flatly denied their petition for religious freedom, the fate of all American ayahuasca churches hangs in the balance. Now more than ever, the broader community of psychedelic researchers, journalists, and advocates need to end the silence regarding psychedelic facilitator misconduct. Unfortunately, many within the broader psychedelic community have continually refused to discuss the dark tales stemming from Soul Quest. I ask my audience once again, what can be said about those who stay silent when others in our community die? Back in 1963, Bob Dylan poetically asked us, how many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? Yes, and how many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? Yes, and how many deaths will it take until he knows that too many people have died? The answer is blowing in the wind. Just to help give everyone a broad overview of what we'll be talking about today, I'll be discussing the history of the church, its founder, its liability waivers, their pseudoscientific claims offered within the literature, and other indisputable facts surrounding the church. And after I share all that, I'll be discussing the lawsuits and allegations of impropriety surrounding the church. And as you will come to understand, even some of those indisputable facts have ambiguous, or shall we say, uncertain elements about them. Beyond that, some of those aforementioned allegations are supported by concrete facts. Having said that, please take everything I say with a grain of salt. If you have any questions related to this podcast, please feel free to reach out to me personally or leave a comment below. As a quick aside, I'd like to dedicate the second half of this podcast to answering questions, but again, feel free to join in at any time if you want. If anybody feels so inclined, I encourage others to independently verify or even disprove anything I've said within this podcast. I stand by my reporting, but I'm always willing to consider evidence that contradicts my understanding of the facts at hand. I welcome open discussion, and I wish to encourage others to come forward with their own stories regarding Soul Quest, whether they be good or bad. And before I begin to talk more about this subject, I wish to ask for your patience as I attempt to provide a succinct overview of an incredibly complex tale. I've known far too many details of this story for far too long, and that's why I've decided to produce this podcast in its entirety. Those who know me well understand that I'm aware of the healing power of ayahuasca, especially given my work with nonprofit organizations that brew ayahuasca to PTSD afflicted veterans. Just to offer a moment of transparency for everyone, I'm glad that perhaps thousands of people, veterans included, have immensely benefited from Soul Quest's ayahuasca ceremonies. Though I have myself experienced spiritual awakenings with plant medicines, I feel a calling to discuss the dark side of ayahuasca. I will warn you, there will be harrowing moments in the story that I'm about to share. Please consider that when deciding when and where to listen to this podcast. I have a question for my audience. Is there room for critical dialogue about psychedelics? Given that ayahuasca continually receives favorable press coverage, I feel that there's room for me to provide a counterbalance to the ongoing, overly enthusiastic narrative about psychedelics. Having said that, I'm aware that anything remotely negative about psychedelics is often labeled as sensationalism and the like. Lest we forget, disagreeing with the group narrative and raising valid criticisms is a necessary component of constructive discourse. I refuse to concern myself with those who will be offended by my choice to share publicly available information in as non-biased of a manner as I can. Today, I'll be highlighting some issues that I believe will hinder the psychedelic renaissance, psychedelic revival, whatever you want to call it, if they are not substantively addressed in an immediate fashion. My sole motivation in providing this information to others is to prevent harm to those seeking healing through ayahuasca, to encourage total transparency, and above all, to stimulate constructive conversation so that our broader community can chart a path forward. For the record, I openly welcome any and all SoulQuest officials, former or present, to appear with to come on this podcast to discuss the matters contained herein. Before I get into the heart of this matter, I want to remind my audience that while visions of the divine are often described in terms of visions of light, Dante poetically described God in the final lines of Paradiso as the love that carries the sun and other stars. And if there is indeed a divine force that carries objects throughout space and time, then I pray that everyone may be graced by its presence and thus become inspired to take the right action at the right time. It's with these words that I'll begin to share what I know about about SoulQuest. Give me a quick second. Somebody's at my door. Sorry about that, everyone. So, looks like we have some more people joining the podcast. It's good to see that. So, just to give everyone a sense of perspective on how religious freedoms are interpreted within the state of Florida, I'd like to quote a portion of the Florida Constitution. Within the third section of the first article of my state's Constitution, it is stated that, quote, "There shall be no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting or penalizing the free exercise thereof. Religious freedom shall not justify practices inconsistent with public morals, peace, or safety." So, enter SoulQuest Church of Mother Earth. It was founded in circa 2014 by Mr. Christopher Joe Young and Verena Young. The two of them were married back in 2012 and started the church shortly thereafter, riding on the coattails of the Supreme Court decision of Gonzalez v. União do Vegetal. SoulQuest has now administered ayahuasca to, according to Chris Young, over 16,000 people as of January 2021. And that makes SoulQuest an especially remarkable organization, wouldn't you say? Given this figure, they've quite possibly administered more ayahuasca to more people than any ayahuasca church within the United States. And, simple question, what draws people in? It's probably the most accessible means for Americans to access ayahuasca without having to travel outside of the United States. When Chris Young was asked in a January 2021 deposition why he chose Orlando of all places to establish this church, he responded by saying that, quote, or rather, that Orlando was, quote, the right location, central to everyone in the state of Florida. The weather was great, and there was an international airport, end quote. Mr. Young concurred with the deposing attorney that Orlando afforded SoulQuest, quote, the easiest means of travel for their participant members, end quote. Now, unlike the União do Vegetal, or specifically O Centro Espírita Beneficente União do Vegetal, SoulQuest openly advertises their services, or rather openly advertises their ayahuasca ceremonies. Within many ayahuasca religions, proselytizing is, at the very least, discouraged, in some cases forbidden. So this makes them a bit different from the rest, wouldn't you say? As the world witnesses a reemergence in the interest of psychedelic compounds and therapies, this ayahuasca church, SoulQuest, is reaping profits from those who seek to encounter the divine through ayahuasca. SoulQuest is located on a 4.5-acre property that's on the east side of Orlando. Like I said, only a 10-minute drive from UCF. Their 3-day, 2-night ayahuasca retreats used to cost in the ballpark of about $400 back in the day. But since then, once you factor in a membership fee and everything else, a 3-day, 2-night ayahuasca retreat comes out to about $1,000. That's right, $1,000. And for that donation, you'll receive a number of different services, including meals, bedding, yoga session, workshops, rapé, and integration. But I'm not here to promote their services, am I? Now, let's move on to a different topic, or at least a different subject about SoulQuest. Let's talk about their taxes. And don't worry, I know taxes are usually seen as a boring subject, but trust me, you'll find this pretty interesting. Despite the fact that SoulQuest is registered to do business as a wellness center within the state of Florida, SoulQuest plainly admits on their website that they don't pay federal taxes. Quote, per the IRS, a church does not need a 501c3 tax exemption, as the IRS code states that SoulQuest Church of Mother Earth, Inc. is already a compliant tax-exempt entity. We do reserve the right to apply for a formal IRS letter of determination at some future date as decided by our elders and directors, end quote. Now, I'm not here to say that SoulQuest isn't a church. I'm not here to say that they need to pay taxes. However, it's certainly an exercise of bad faith, no pun intended, to not engage with the IRS as one should in this case. In my humble opinion, SoulQuest is openly inviting scrutiny from the government with choices like these. I mean, imagine if your local town's megachurch just openly proclaimed that they were tax exempt without having already applied for that status. Anyway, just to give everybody a bit more background on Mr. Young, I'm going to provide everyone with a quick biography on the founder of SoulQuest. Just to help everyone follow along, within the show notes, you'll find a Google Drive link with a bunch of images, videos, and documents. And at this point, I'm on pictures 11 to 14. That way you can follow along. So according to Mr. Young's January 2021 deposition, he actually started DJing in the early to mid 90s while in Louisiana. At one point, he ran a mobile DJ business in Florida, Exquisite Entertainment, as it was known. It specifically catered to weddings and bachelorette parties in the Southwest Florida region. And according to Mr. Young, or at least within that deposition, One of Exquisite Entertainment's specialties was a so-called stripogram service. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but if you read the deposition, you can find out a bit more. Mr. Young left the DJing industry around 2011, 2012 because, according to his deposition, quote, "It was time to settle down and be a father, be a man, not a party guy." In the same deposition, Mr. Young detailed his time volunteering in a psychiatric unit, how he obtained his degree in phlebotomy, and the approximate 7 years that it took for him to obtain his EMT certification. Yes, 7 years to obtain his EMT certification. That is the length of time he described. Mr. Young also affirmed that he was trained in both basic life support and advanced life support. And despite all these certifications and internships, Mr. Young, shall we say, became disenchanted with the field of modern medicine and, as he put it, quote, "completely just gave up," end quote, on pursuing a job in the medical field around the time frame that he gave was 2010 to 2011. Now, during this time, he was still DJing and working at a restaurant to make ends meet. But shortly thereafter, he met Verena, his soon-to-be wife, and emigrated to Germany. That would have been 2012, October of 2012. And shortly thereafter, Verena became pregnant, and Chris became a self-described stay-at-home father. During 2014, Mr. Young discovered ayahuasca during an 11-day retreat on Ibiza, an island off the eastern coast of Spain, near Barcelona. In the Vice article, "Florida's Ayahuasca Church Wants to Go Legal," Joshua Adler wrote that Mr. Young, quote, "gave himself what he called a surprise birthday present of an 11-day retreat. On the third day, he learned that his 5 months pregnant wife had a miscarriage. His ayahuasca-powered visions revealed what Young described as shadow people that told him that he would have another child and that he should keep going with the ceremony. The same visions," this is an ongoing quote, "the same visions also instructed him to go back to the U.S. and to open a church, and as Chris Young put it, quote, to provide the medicine to future generations, to make it accessible, and to propagate its growth." In the same article, Mr. Young was quoted as saying that, quote, "My God is planet Earth. My Jesus, my Savior, is ayahuasca." All right. Now let's spend a bit of time delving into Mr. Young's career in the medical field. According to his biography on the SoulQuest website, by the way, this should be picture number 20, I believe. Mr. Young, quote, "studied emergency medicine and received a certificate for EMT, where he worked as an ER tech at a local hospital." All right. Mr. Young also claims to have worked in the field of emergency medicine for approximately 4 years, according to DEA documents. And after scouring through statewide databases of certified EMTs, I discovered that Mr. Young was indeed certified as an EMT beginning in August of 2004. However, if you cross-reference this with his January 2021 deposition, you'll notice that Mr. Young's certification lapsed in December of 2006. Yes, just 2 years after obtaining it. Unless Mr. Young was recertified as an EMT under a different ID number, which would be beyond my knowledge, the evidence appears to indicate that he has not been certified as an EMT for over a decade. While under oath in January of 2021, Mr. Young was directly asked about his alleged 4-year-long career in emergency medicine, as so described in DEA documents. Here are some of his answers. Quote, "I didn't really have a job as it. I do believe there were a few jobs that I went to. I did a lot of interning on the back of a truck, or what would be considered the back of an ambulance, and I did a lot of work interning in ER departments." He goes on to say that this was free work, more for training, because I was still doing other types of jobs such as serving, DJing, and stuff like that. I was really trying to hone in on my skills and actually get my foot in the door. He goes on to say that, quote, I was not hired per se, but working, whether it was in the ER department as an internship. He also admitted that EMTs are tasked with, quote, quelling emergencies to the point that a patient is as stable as possible, end quote. You'll have to forgive my cats. They are just being so needy right now. Now, that quote I just mentioned about an EMT's obligations, that's going to come into play later. Keep that in mind. Now, unless I have misinterpreted Mr. Young's deposition, it does not appear that he ever held a salaried position within the field of emergency medicine or the medical field in general. If there happens to be any information to the contrary, I'd be more than open to see it. In fact, I'd love to see it. Now, I'm going to read a section of Mr. Young's current biography on SoulQuest once more. I ask my audience to question the truth value of this statement. Quote, he studied emergency medicine and received a certificate for EMT where he worked as an ER tech at a local hospital. Or how about this? In Mr. Young's January 2021 deposition, he stated that, quote, I'm a basic EMT, not a paramedic. Now, Mr. Young's apparent use of the present tense indicates a belief that he is presently certified, but I have yet to see any information that would indicate that Mr. Young has held EMT certification anytime within the last decade. If my audience doesn't consider any of that evidence to be a misrepresentation of the facts at hand, then the following story might meet your high burden of proof. Just to properly illustrate this point, SoulQuest has on multiple occasions described their ayahuasca ceremonies as entirely legal and perfectly legal. Pretty strong language, wouldn't you say? Now, they say this despite DMT's prohibition within the state of Florida and at the federal level. In his January 2021 deposition, Mr. Young stated that, quote, I don't recall ever telling anyone that they could be arrested for consuming ayahuasca at SoulQuest, end quote. He also said that, quote, I think anybody that understands the Constitution, I think anybody that understands the Constitution understands their freedom of religion, understands their right to use a controlled substance as a sacrament, end quote. He also said that, quote, we didn't need them, that is the DEA, we didn't need them to grant us an exemption that didn't need to exist. Freedom of religion is what it is, freedom of religion. Regardless of what it is, we were just going to do our job to try to appease the DEA, but there's no reason for us to go there and beg for our use ayahuasca as a religious sacrament. We're doing it to be nice, end quote. Now that seems to indicate a belief that, well, I'll use the exact phrase he used. They're trying to appease the DEA. They don't think that this is something that they necessarily have to do, this exemption process. Now, in the August 2020 Netflix docuseries Unwell, Chris Young stated that SoulQuest continues to operate, quote, on the pretext that if Santo Daime and the UDV can partake in the medicine, then we should be able to as well, end quote. So that's essentially saying, hey, if they get to, we have the right to as well. And that's not really how it works, and I'm about to explain why. Contrary to Mr. Young's understanding of religious freedom jurisprudence, the 2006 UDV decision granted just the UDV an exemption from the Controlled Substances Act, or rather, DMT's inclusion within the Controlled Substances Act. Perhaps the best way for me to explain this would be to directly quote the ruling itself. Near the end of their unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court made it clear that, quote, "We reaffirmed just last term the feasibility of case-by-case considerations of religious exemptions to generally applicable rules." You heard that right. Case-by-case considerations of religious exemptions. Somebody should show this passage from the UDV decision to Mr. Young. Let me be clear. Nowhere within the UDV decision will you find any sort of rhetoric that would imply that the Supreme Court was allowing other ayahuasca churches to be exempt from the Controlled Substances Act. So, Soul Quest got a rather rude awakening back in August of 2016 when the DEA sent them a letter notifying the church that they were in violation of federal laws, rather the federal prohibition of DMT, and implored the church to stop offering ceremonies, which they did for a short while. In fact, they notified their followers on Facebook about this exact matter. Quote, "It's with a heavy heart that we announce that Soul Quest Ayahuasca Church of Mother Earth will have to take a temporary break from our sacred ayahuasca sacrament as of August 4th of 2016. We received a letter from the DEA advising us that we need to petition the DEA for an exemption to use our sacred sacrament ayahuasca. It is our obligation to all of you to become federally compliant. This untimely break will ultimately be in the best interest of the church and our church family members." Now, despite the fact that the DEA was aware of Soul Quest ceremonies at this time, the church began offering ayahuasca once again as early as 2017. Want proof? Just look up Kevin Rupchin's lawsuit with Soul Quest. I'll actually be talking about that specific case more in detail near the tail end of this podcast, so stay tuned. Now, shortly after the DEA came down on Soul Quest in 2016, the church filed a 156-page exemption request to the DEA. This was specifically in August of 2017, but that request was denied outright in April of 2021. And within that denial, the DEA cited the fact that the Controlled Substances Act that Soul Quest being exempted from the Controlled Substances Act would endanger more people, or as they controversially put it, quote, customers. This is rather this topic has been a point of contention in the psychedelic community, whether or not Soul Quest is a business. Like I said earlier, it is a objective fact, that Soul Quest is registered to do business in the state of Florida. There's something called a DBA. Look it up. They're registered to do business in the state of Florida as a wellness center. So they are a church, but at the same time, I think it's fair to say that they are also a business. So keep in mind that within that same denial, the DEA also cited the fact that Soul Quest was not, quote, complying with its own health and safety protocols. This is a rather alarming allegation. And the DEA also made it clear that, simply put, Soul Quest had some explaining to do. There were a lot of very concerning allegations which they went into detail about, which I will not talk about right now. But moving forward, things changed on March 4th of this year when the Middle District Court dismissed Soul Quest's religious freedom case without prejudice, meaning that they lost, but they could appeal, which they did. And at the present moment, The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals has the ability to accept or reject the appeal. This, shall we say, roulette wheel is spinning, and Soul Quest has placed all their blue chips on the line, or at least so it seems. What do you think will come of all this? You'll have to excuse my cats. Quite the situation we have going on the east side of Orlando, wouldn't you say? Soul Quest is openly defying the DEA, and as Chris Young personally told me at Wonderland Miami, to practice our faith. This was the card he gave me. I wish I had time to talk to him more, but I only talked with him for about 30 seconds before he ran off. Like I said, I'd love to talk with him and any other Soul Quest officials about this. But getting back to the topic, as I speak these very words, there is an ayahuasca ceremony that's going on at Soul Quest. People have partaken of the brew. And if you look at their calendar, there's another, I believe, 21 ayahuasca retreats scheduled for the rest of this year. Now, I understand that the pursuit of happiness can sometimes involve risking one's own life through acts of civil disobedience. However, in my humble opinion, that pursuit of happiness becomes unethical once that pursuit begins to risk the lives and freedom of others. At this point, each and every one of Soul Quest's ceremonies currently places their congregants at risk of witnessing a raid by the DEA or local law enforcement. Given that the DEA's denial was released over a year ago, and their appeal may be denied, I'm simply waiting for the other shoe to drop. I ask my audience, what do you think will come of congregants who get arrested simply because they came to Soul Quest seeking healing, or they came to Soul Quest seeking an encounter with the divine? What will happen to those people? How will this impact other ayahuasca churches, especially those in Florida? These are questions I continually ask myself, but unfortunately, I don't have the means to provide good answers at this point. In the meantime, though, the best we can do is warn others about Soul Quest's lack of legality. Let me be clear, though. Police raids aren't the only risk associated with attending an ayahuasca retreat at this church. Whenever people sign their liability waivers, they're potentially gambling with their lives by exposing themselves to inherently unjust power dynamics. Now, in the last episode of the Ultradelic podcast, I discussed the implications of entheogenic churches compelling congregants to sign liability waivers before participating within ceremonies where psychedelic sacraments are employed. Indeed, Soul Quest's liability waivers compel congregants to, quote, indemnify, hold harmless, and promise not to sue, end quote, Soul Quest, even in cases of, quote, death, serious injury, and property loss, end quote, precipitated by, quote, the negligence or fault, end quote, of Soul Quest officials. If plant medicine churches model their liability waivers after Soul Quest, it would, as I see it, put far too much power in the hands of plant medicine facilitators, many of whom, keep in mind, operate without medical licensure in a community which suffers from a dearth of watchdogs and meaningful regulation. Liability waivers, such as those employed by Soul Quest, in my humble opinion, raise more questions than they answer. Like I've said before, liability waivers can ethically be utilized to inform potential congregants about risks associated with ingesting particular substances, But questions of ethics arise once those liability waivers afford legal immunity to facilitators who may have committed wrongdoing. Just to calm down any potential naysayers and validate my claims, I'll provide all the pertinent quotes from SoulQuest's liability waivers. And although the language you're about to hear seems plain at times, please consider the implications. If you want to follow along, just look at images 41 and 42 in the Google Drive link. Quote, I hereby assume all of the risks of participating in any all activities associated with this church and its retreats, including by way of example and not limitation, any risks that may arise from negligence or carelessness on the part of the persons or entities being released, from dangerous activities or defective equipment or property owned, maintained, or controlled by them, drinking of ayahuasca, partaking of rapé, participating of combo cleanse, or because of their possible liability without fault. Period. Goes on to say that, quote, I certify that I am physically fit, have sufficiently prepared or trained for participation in this ceremonial ritual, and have not been advised to not participate by a qualified medical professional. I certify that there are no health-related reasons or problems or any medications which would preclude my participation in this activity. I acknowledge that this accident waiver and release of liability form will be used by the church, sponsors, and organizers of the activity in which I may participate, and that it will govern my actions and responsibilities at said activity. In consideration of my application and permitting me to participate in this activity, I hereby take action for myself, my executors, administrators, heirs, next of kin, successors, and assigns as follows. I waive, release, and discharge from any and all liability, including but not limited to liability arising from the negligence or fault of the entities or persons released for my death, disability, personal injury, property damage, property theft, or actions of any kind which may hereafter occur to me, including my traveling to and from this activity. I'm just going to stop it there. Does anybody in my community think that these sorts of liability waivers can foster healthy power dynamics between plant medicine facilitators and their clients or congregants? From my perspective, insufficiently trained plant medicine facilitators might not ever have to face justice in extreme cases of negligence and or impropriety with liability waivers such as these. And please do keep in mind that Chris Young has publicly admitted that people come to his church because they are, quote, desperate for access to ayahuasca. Simply check out the Netflix series Unwell. It's clear as day. The full quote for context is as follows, quote, these people are desperate. They're looking for answers, end quote. Now, if people are desperate for something, it would follow that they'd do anything to obtain it, right? Well, that's one of the driving factors that leads people to dishing out $1,000 for a weekend retreat, and in the process, sign away the rights to sue the church under pretty much any circumstance. One law firm out of Davie, Florida, says this about liability waivers. Quote, before signing a waiver, you should read it and understand everything in the waiver. Not all waivers are the same. If you don't understand something or are uncomfortable with something in the waiver, you should not sign it or see if you can modify the waiver. You would want to ensure that you do not sign away your rights You want to ensure that you do not sign your rights away in some instances. A serious injury or death that you cannot collect on can be devastating to the injured and or their loved ones. Keep in mind that'll come into play later. You know, many of those who visit Soul Quest do so because they wish to find healing. They're coming because they suffer from trauma. They wish to experience a spiritual revelation or spiritual enlightenment, an encounter with God, perhaps. But with a lack of regulation in the sector, no one can be held to account if and when these vulnerable, desperate people are victimized. It's rather strange that the same people who wish to operate a literal church wish to be absolved of culpability whenever allegations of impropriety are raised simply because people have been harmed during the course of a plant medicine ceremony. Given the widespread lack of medical licensure within these entheogenic churches, concerns have been raised about how plant medicine facilitators can and or should respond in medical emergencies. Given the general illegality of these churches, we should keep in mind that whenever people are harmed by facilitators from these organizations, they're usually reluctant to come forward to law enforcement officials because of the fact that they might find themselves receiving unwanted attention from law enforcement outfits, including potentially arrest. And that, in a sense, shields these churches from liability. Before I get too ahead of myself, I'll just say that I'm going to touch on liability waivers once more in this podcast. Now, in case you don't know, Soul Quest offers more than just ayahuasca, ayahuasca ceremonies. Beyond breathwork sessions, they also offer integration services, veteran meetups, yoga sessions, and quote-unquote shadow ceremonies. They also provide Kambo, Rapé, and allegedly a variety of other substances. If you check out their website, there's little to no information about the risks associated with the ingestion of these particular substances, and instead, they focus on their purported benefits. You heard me right. There are indeed risks associated with ingesting ayahuasca. Just to provide my audience with credible evidence that ayahuasca can lead to adverse reactions, I've cited my sources in the show notes below, and I've even assembled a compilation of videos in a Twitter thread that speaks to this effect. If you look in the show notes, that's link number 4. Perhaps the most noteworthy of these resources would be the 2016 Insider article called "This Silicon Valley Angel Investor Loves a Drug That Gave Him Hours of Seizures." Eek. This article, written by Biz Carson, noted that famed author and podcaster Tim Ferriss continues to use ayahuasca, I'm guessing to this day, even after a harrowing early experience. Says Tim Ferriss, quote, "I felt like I was being torn apart and killed 1,000 times a second for 2 hours." Carson, the article's author, claimed that Ferriss's feeling of disintegration, quote, "was followed by hours of grand mal seizures." Carson also added that Ferriss had, quote, "rug burns on his face the next day." Keep that in mind, it'll come into play later. Now, this particular fact about seizures and rug burns, that's something I didn't know about until a short time ago. I didn't realize that there's actually a potential risk to experience a seizure during an ayahuasca experience. Mind you, it is rather rare. However, it can happen. Like Tim Ferriss talks about in his book, Tools of the Titans, quote, No session is quite the same as any other. For me, ayahuasca has been among, excuse me, my apologies, here we go. Quote, no session is quite the same as any other. For me, ayahuasca has been unique among psychedelics for many reasons. In my second ever session, for example, I had the scariest experience of my life. It involved uncontrolled grand mal seizures on a floor for 2 hours, among other things. I woke to rug burns all over my face and hands, and I was untethered from reality for the next 48 hours. Thankfully, I'd hired someone to watch me 24/7 during and after the weekend. I mentioned this cautionary tale, Tim Ferriss goes on to say, because ayahuasca has become terribly trendy. He also adds that, quote, I consider all this to be psychological Russian roulette. My suggestion is that you treat ayahuasca as if you are planning to have brain tumor removed by a brain surgeon. Spiritually, this is effectively what you're attempting. In such a case, you would spend months, if possible, researching all of the best doctors. You would treat it like a life and death decision because of what could go wrong if it were done incorrectly. From my direct experiences, I feel like ayahuasca warrants this level of caution, respect, preparation, and due diligence. Rather strong words. I was talking with James Kent about this 2 months ago on his podcast, Dose Nation, and offered that quote. And he pretty much said that, well, that's a really roundabout way of saying that you're engaging in a dangerous activity. Yeah, you could say that if you go about it in all the right ways, you'll have a fun time or a good time or a beneficial experience. But if you don't, then you can have a bad time. And well, there are many ways to think about this. From one perspective, many activities that humans routinely engage in are indeed dangerous. Think about base jumping. Think about parachuting. Think about working as a firefighter. There are many risks that come about with different occupations and activities, and people can still go about engaging in those activities safely through harm reduction measures and safety protocols. However, at the same time, there's a lot of overabundant enthusiasm in the psychedelic community about these substances. So it's important to keep all of these perspectives in mind. Now, if you look closely on SoulQuest's website, you'll find pseudoscientific claims about the therapeutic benefits of substances that they offer as quote-unquote therapeutic modalities. Now, folks, what you're about to hear borders on quackery. And I'm being rather intentional with my word choice here. Hope you don't mind me. Let's start with ayahuasca. One article on their webpage discusses ayahuasca, quote, as a form of cancer treatment. If you're following along within the Google Drive link, it's number 47 in the pictures. Within this article, the anonymous author cites how a single individual's colonic tumors, quote, disappeared without additional surgeries, drugs, and chemotherapy, end quote, after they drank ayahuasca. Now, in my opinion, my humble opinion, it's rather unethical to utilize unsighted anecdotal data to inform cancer patients that ayahuasca, quote, is able to cure, end quote. their condition, especially after claiming that this church, one's own church, is one of the few quote unquote legal means of obtaining this supposed cure. I'll quote segments of this article just to show that my claims are not based in statements that were taken out of context. Quote, due to U.S. policies, some of the most healing forms of cancer treatments are being withheld from us because they are considered taboo. However, once a loved one or a family member is diagnosed, many will attempt to try various methods of healing to save them. If any natural substance is able to cure somebody or save lives, then why should the news not be spread that such a gift such as this exists? This is why we're making it our mission to educate you on the physical and spiritual benefits of this amazing plant, likely referring to Banisteriopsis caapi. They go on to say that for more information on our upcoming events, so you can join us and begin or continue your journey, click here. And that link right there is a link to join SoulQuest as a member free of charge. Just as a word of warning to any entheogenic church officials that are listening to this podcast, it is imperative to abstain from any sort of behavior that resides within the realm of charlatanism or giving out false hopes or otherwise misinforming people. Or how about this? Marketing to vulnerable populations with treatment-resistant health disorders. Marketing high-priced psychedelic cures to vulnerable populations is highly problematic territory, just in case that wasn't clear. Articles like the one I just mentioned are the exact reason why psychedelic facilitators and the broader psychedelic community need a critical, independent, and investigative press. Without watchdogs to report on such stories, our field would be worse off for the wear, or at least in my opinion. Now let's move on to Kambo. On SoulQuest's website, if you look at picture 48, the church describes Kambo as, quote, the vaccine of the forest, a supposed vaccine which is made of, quote, several peptides that bind to receptors in our body. Now, since SoulQuest is depriving its congregation of the cold hard facts, I'll make this clear as day for everyone. What SoulQuest fails to mention within their literature, as far as I can tell, is that Kambo contains a variety of opioid agonists. That's right, these peptides bind to opioid receptors. It didn't really clarify what kind of receptors those were, did they? Wouldn't that be important to include in Kambo's description? Especially for those who have previously dealt with or are presently struggling with opioid use disorder, also known as OUD. Indeed, issues of relapse could arise when former opioid addicts are unknowingly administered Kambo. Just to be clear, Kambo is not a controlled substance within the state of Florida or at the federal level. For everyone's reference, it is a substance that's it's a secretion that's derived from a frog known as Philomedusa bicolor. This Kambo is a waxy substance composed of multiple opioid agonists as well as a variety of other psychoactive and non-psychoactive substances. One of these opioid agonists, dermorphin, is, according to one source, approximately 30 to 40 times as potent as morphine. After applying Kambo onto freshly burned skin, this so-called tree frog medicine reliably induces a variety of side effects, including vomiting, rapid heart rate, and muscle weakness. It also allegedly comes with a variety of benefits. SoulQuest's website goes too far as to claim that Kambo may be used to, quote, treat AIDS, cancer, cardiovascular issues, chronic pain, circulatory issues, depression, fertility problems, herpes, hepatitis, migraines, skin problems, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, organ malfunction, and even vision problems. Another SoulQuest webpage, which is also linked in the show notes below, asserts that Kambo can be used to, quote, encourage strength and immunity, to cure illnesses, and even to help in hunting and getting rid of bad luck. Now, these last details that I mentioned are actually what Kambo is traditionally used for in traditional indigenous societies. But at the same time, let's keep in mind that all of those previous allegations, claims regarding its benefits are completely unsupported by the medical literature. There is yet to be a single controlled study that has examined any of those claims. Let's move on to Rapé, another one of the substances that SoulQuest utilizes within their ceremonies. On one of their web pages, they claim that Rapé can, quote, help with mental illness and even aid in addiction treatment. It provides a sense of calm when used on a regular basis and can lead to an overall change in mood. It therefore helps relieve depression. It clears your chakras, energy points, by detoxing you both physically and spiritually. It prepares for intense experiences like ayahuasca ceremonies by removing bad energy, end quotes. Now, when you consider all of these claims in conjunction with their liability waivers that bar congregants from suing SoulQuest, even when the, quote, negligence or fault, end quote, of SoulQuest officials has led to someone's death, things start getting pretty dark really quick, in my opinion. Do you think SoulQuest's congregants fully appreciate or understand what they're signing up for with those liability waivers? Let's take off our rose-tinted glasses, folks. Before I move on to sharing Brandon Begley's story with everyone, I want to make it clear that SoulQuest has benefited from near unwavering support from the psychedelic community. I want to take a quick pause to mention that Christopher has just commented. I want to read it aloud for everyone's convenience. Quote, you mentioned earlier that people overestimate drug risks compared to risks for comparable activities. My go-to chart for those kinds of comparisons is this. It looks like Christopher is going to keep posting, so I'll keep you advised on that. But like I was saying, SoulQuest benefits from near unwavering support from countless members of the broader psychedelic community. Even prominent lawyers, such as George G. Lake, have openly praised SoulQuest and requested that we stay silent on matters like the Easter Sunday tragedy of 2018. For those who don't know, George Lake, Esquire, is the author of The Law of Entheogenic Churches of the United States. He has plugged this book on a number of different podcasts, and I have personally yet to read it. I have read sections that he has posted online, but yet to read the entire thing. He has, however, posted this just last October. Quote, it will be important that, as a community, we follow SoulQuest's journey through the federal court system. While many people in this community are not fans of SoulQuest for one reason or another, it and its members are part of our community, and what happens to SoulQuest will have ripple effects throughout the entheogenic church space in the United States. I respectfully request everyone put aside any negative attitudes or feelings they may have towards SoulQuest and show love and support for the organization as it navigates this extremely difficult and highly specialized area of law. That's his perspective. At the present moment, SoulQuest stands accused of numerous acts of facilitator misconduct. Beyond allegedly misrepresenting themselves as having an indigenous lineage, beyond their allegedly exorbitant fees, their Their alleged taking advantage of volunteers. They're allegedly conducting far too large of ayahuasca ceremonies. That is about 100 participants at once. That's not counting facilitators and SoulQuest officials. It's not always that high. In the past, it was certainly smaller, but at this point, it's routine for SoulQuest ceremonies to feature 70, 80, 90, 100 people at a time. And that's a large amount of people to hold space for. I just want to give a quick shout out to Christopher, who's watching right now. I really appreciate you. Christopher was here last week when I actually aired the, get this, just as a quick moment of transparency for everyone. I actually aired this podcast last week, but there were so many audio issues during the broadcast that I just had to come back on and share this information with everyone. So I want to give Christopher a quick shout out for coming back on and talking about this with me. So we're talking about the allegations here. Keep in mind they're allegations. These aren't facts. These are allegations. But they're worthy of discussion, in my opinion. Along with what I just said, SoulQuest also stands accused of taking in massive profits from this plant medicine without truly giving back to the indigenous communities of South America. Now, I'm sure Chris Young and others would reply by saying that they originally imported ayahuasca from indigenous communities and provided support for those communities by purchasing ayahuasca through them. However, that's no longer the case. They currently brew their own ayahuasca with imported materials. Along with that, I'm sure Chris Young and the rest of SoulQuest would go so far as to say that the donations that are offered to the church are applied directly towards expanding SoulQuest's outreach so that it's potentially the biggest and safest place to drink ayahuasca in the United States. Now, that's an ideal vision. I'd go so far as to say that I would want that. The safest place in the United States to drink ayahuasca. If such a thing could exist, I'd be down for it. Point being, though, I'd be willing to entertain such arguments about SoulQuest being the safest place to drink ayahuasca, but that's not really the case. They don't really have a perfect track record regarding their conduct, and I will get into that. As a quick side note, we should remember that there are some ayahuasca churches that don't charge at all for those who wish to participate within their ceremonies. There's one Vice article that I've shared with everyone in the Google Drive link that discusses a truly legal Canadian ayahuasca church that asks for a mere $600. Excuse me, $60 to attend a ceremony. But like I said, some don't request a donation. Some, I'll put it this way. Some people are less concerned about the money. They're more concerned about providing their sacrament to others who share their faith. So if SoulQuest is currently charging about $1,000 for a 3-day, 2-night ayahuasca retreat, what's so special about their services? Fair question, right? Why the high price? Now, like I've said before, they do offer a variety of services that are complementary to the ayahuasca experience. The breathwork workshops, the yoga sessions, the integration, what have you. And it's undoubtable that they have glowing reviews, many of them, I believe, in the thousands. But what can be said about those who don't have such a good experience? Consider this. SoulQuest's webpage includes only 4 and 5-star reviews. Wouldn't you say that's a bit biased? Now, I'm in no way doubting that people have had beneficial experiences through Soul Quest and their ceremonies, but we have to take into account all perspectives if we wish to truly appreciate the nature of this situation. Because many of Soul Quest's 1-star reviews contain rather concerning allegations, I've decided to post those in the show notes for anyone who is interested in reading more. Specifically, they are, again, in the Google Drive link. You know, this reminds me of something that my friend told me while I was at Wonderland Miami back in November of last year. I got to see one of my heroes while I was there. I also call him my friend, but he's also a hero of mine. Sandor Iron Rope, for those who know him. I was talking with him about a few different things, and we got to talking about ayahuasca. I'm used to talking with him about peyote, but we were talking about ayahuasca. And he told me something that kind of surprised me at first. He said that ayahuasca isn't for everyone. Those were his exact words. And I'll be honest, at first, I kind of brushed it aside. I didn't appreciate what he was trying to say. And with each passing day, I'm realizing the truth value of that statement. Not everyone is able to safely take ayahuasca for a variety of reasons. I can't go into all those different reasons on this podcast, but that is something to consider if and when you decide to take ayahuasca. Getting back to what Sandor was telling me, there are a lot of people who hear about ayahuasca in the news, hear that there are people who are benefiting from partaking of this brew, and they go into it with these high expectations. They go into it with all these ideas of what might happen. They go into it with the knowledge that it will be an unworldly experience unlike anything else they've ever had before. And it leads to what I and others have termed a Disneyland sort of mentality. A lot of people are going into this for the right reasons, but they don't fully appreciate the nature of the situation. And to that extent, I'd like to quote the words of Moises Pianco, who's a member of the Ashaninka people of northern Brazil, in a 2016 Vice article titled "Millennials on Spirit Quests Are Ruining Everything About Ayahuasca." Moises was quoted as saying that, quote, "The sacred art of Indians has been transformed into entertainment. Ayahuasca is no joke. The white man wants to patent our ritual to use it as one or more ways to make money, but the spiritual world is not for sale." As a quick aside, I want to make it clear that while this article does mention spirit quests, it in no way touches on soul quest. Just want to make that clear. In the Vice article, "Crappy Ayahuasca Can Kill You," Michael Allen asked the author Robert Tyndall why tourists are, as he put it, falling victim to unethical practitioners within the booming ayahuasca tourism sector. Tyndall replied by saying that, quote, "There's no quality control. There's no knowledge of lineage. So Westerners go online and see ayahuasca retreats or Amazonian retreats, and it doesn't even occur to them to inquire who the shaman is, what his lineage is, whether he has any recommendations. It seems to be a Disneyland mentality. It's a setup for disaster." Because with all these people, all these naive people bringing money in, there's an explosion of people setting up centers, making brews of different levels of quality. He goes on to say that people are going to keep dying so long as this goes on. Now, while it's true that there are only scant reports of people dying shortly after drinking ayahuasca, one of those cases happens to have involved SoulQuest. Remember when I mentioned the Easter Sunday tragedy of 2018? Time to talk about Brandon Begley. Excuse me 1 second. We're delving into rather heavy territory, so I need to get a little bit of help from my friends. So, where to start? I first heard about Brandon Begley, back in 2018, but at that time I didn't know his name. Specifically, I had learned about the fact that somebody had died shortly after attending a retreat at SoulQuest. At that time, Brandon's name was redacted within police reports and the news footage, so he was unknown at the time. And around that time, I was under the misunderstanding that Brandon's passing was, shall we say, a coincidence, that it just so happened that he died shortly after. This was not the case at all. And with each passing day, I realized that there were really concerning details surrounding the case. Fast forward to 2019, and Brandon's name becomes a matter of public knowledge. The reports, if you were looking them up at that point, were unredacted, so you can see Brandon's name. And talk began to spread. Not much, though. A few Reddit posts here and there. Not really much on the topic. And all the while, people were focusing more on SoulQuest's religious freedom claim, their ability to legally practice under the law. And despite all of SoulQuest's attestations that they were perfectly legal, right? They're still engaging in this battle with the DEA about their right to partake of their sacrament. And so much energy and effort went into analyzing those religious freedom claims that I was surprised that nobody was spending time looking into Brandon's story. So I decided to. And the more I found, the darker it got. And at a certain point, it came to a breaking point. It was around April of this year, that SoulQuest had lost their case in the Middle District Court, as I brought up earlier. And at that point, I became frustrated that despite the fact that 4 years had passed since Brandon's death, there were no substantive discussions about the events that led to his death. And I was so frustrated with the state of affairs that I personally reached out to Brandon's father. I didn't know him at the time. I was able to reach out to him because it's public knowledge that he is a golf instructor. And I reached out to him through his website and expressed my condolences for his loss. And just as well, I expressed my desire to help bring about justice for his son and what happened to him. And I also shared what would have been good news for him, that SoulQuest lost their religious freedom case. And within about an hour's time, I got a message from the Begley family attorney, Mr. Bill Chapman, who sent me a message saying that thanks for reaching out to JP. And my goodness, I didn't even realize, this is him saying, I didn't even realize that SoulQuest lost their case today. He told me that I was the first person to inform him about this. Apparently I was keeping keeping my eyes glued to the case more than he was. But not everyone can double check these sorts of things every day. I still do to this day, to check if there are any updates on the case, what's going on. Point being, though, that established a professional relationship with Mr. Chapman and Mr. Begley. For the sake of transparency, all of the facts that I'm sharing tonight, and information rather, all of this has been approved by the Begley family, and they want other people to know about this. So I'm going to start breaking down what happened to Brandon. We start in February of 2018, near the end of the month. Brandon attended his first SoulQuest ceremony, and by all accounts, things went well. There were no adverse reactions. It went well enough that Brandon came back for a second retreat on Easter weekend of 2018. So Brandon arrives on Friday, March 28th, I think. He engages in an ayahuasca ceremony, wakes up the next day. I believe he does a daytime ceremony on that day too. Later in that evening, he engages in another ayahuasca ceremony, wakes up on Sunday, has a light juice breakfast before attending an integration ceremony. And shortly after that integration session with SoulQuest staff, he attends a Kambo ceremony. And just to give everyone a bit of information about the integration session, Chris Young said in the deposition that Brandon was in good spirits during the integration session, and that he had a, quote, amazing experience with ayahuasca the night before. For the record, I want to make it clear that the reason that Brandon had a light juice breakfast on that Sunday morning was because of the fact that SoulQuest makes it clear in their literature that Kambo can lead to vomiting. And because of the fact that they don't want people to potentially aspirate vomit during the experience, they highly recommend that people abstain from eating immediately before a Kambo ceremony and only drink water. Now, depending on which pamphlet piece of literature you read, they will give you differing values as to how much water one should drink. That's another issue unto itself. Point being, Brandon partakes in the Kambo ceremony, and He's given the first dot to check to see if he has an allergic reaction. He does not. So a second and third dot are applied, and allegedly at this point, Brandon has not felt the desired effects of Kambo and has not purged, has not felt the desired effects, and asks for a fourth dot, which is applied. Despite this, Brandon did not receive the purported benefits or experience that he was, I shouldn't say promised, but expected to experience. And at this point, here's where the story gets a bit hazy. And I'm going to do my best to illustrate everything so that people can get a good understanding of what happened. But this is the part of the story where we get into the realm of uncertainty. And I want to make that perfectly clear. So Brandon engages in this Kambo ceremony around 11 a.m. noon on that Easter Sunday of 2018. And by about 2 or 3 o'clock, most people, that is most Soul Quest congregants, have left the property and started driving home. Somehow, Brandon is still around at this time. And during this whole midday time period, around 11 noon, 1, 2, 3 o'clock, there doesn't seem to be any information about Brandon's whereabouts or activities at Soul Quest. However, around 5 p.m. on that Easter Sunday, it was alleged by multiple witnesses that Brandon allegedly began to drink large amounts of water in the attempt to purge, because according to one testimony, he had felt an accumulation of bad energy in his stomach and wanted to relieve himself of that bad energy. According to more witness testimonies, Brandon was then allegedly pulled aside. His water cup was taken from him, and he was advised that drinking excessive amounts of water would be dangerous. Shortly thereafter, Brandon began to enter what was described in nearly every single testimony as an erratic state. In almost all other testimonies, he was also described as being lethargic. Now, I'm not sure how one could be erratic and lethargic simultaneously, but keep that in mind. That's one of the pieces of information that we have to go on. So around 5 o'clock, Brandon has allegedly drank too much water and enters into this allegedly erratic and lethargic state. Witness testimonies indicate that Brandon was shortly thereafter he was screaming. No one really indicated that he was screaming anything in particular. The information seems to indicate that he was simply screaming at the top of his lungs. Along with this, he was also essentially flailing around. He wasn't able to really stand up at certain points. He was flailing around on the ground. And he was at a certain point moved outside so that he would be in connection with the earth. They wanted to try and, quote, ground him so that he could be in connection with Mother Earth. This is one of Soul Quest's beliefs, that Mother Earth has healing properties. So they try to ground him, and he starts to hurt himself. He is scraping himself up on the ground. And they then, SilkWest officials then bring out mattresses to help shield Brandon from the ground beneath him and from further injuring himself. At this point, it is my perspective that any reasonable person would have called 911 because of the fact that he was experiencing rather strange behavior, to say the least. So during this time, it's around 6 o'clock now, 6 p.m., that they're trying to revive him. He is more or less in a non-responsive state. And they are attempting to revive him with different shamanic techniques, and it isn't working. So at a certain point, one of the people who is overseeing this situation, his name is Taita Pedro Davila, whose picture is linked below, then suggests that Brandon be given pañuela tea. To be clear, Mr. Davila was the shaman who was employed, or rather contracted, by SoulQuest for that Easter Sunday ayahuasca retreat. And Mr. Davila had suggested that Brandon be given this pañuela tea so that he could help come out, or deal with, or rather be relieved of, the side effects from the ayahuasca. Yes, indeed. Mr. Davila had said that what Brandon was experiencing was attributable to ayahuasca in particular, not Kambo, ayahuasca. This is also supported by the fact that Chris Young, in that deposition, said that what Brandon was going through around this time was, I have to paraphrase here, perfectly normal, or rather common for people to experience at SoulQuest. I think what he said was that, quote, "I've seen this plenty of times before at SoulQuest." So Brandon is in this questionably, while Brandon was in a perhaps legitimate medical emergency, they were attempting all these shamanic techniques, one of which was pañuela tea, which, for those who don't know, is pañuela is a byproduct of sugarcane. It's added to water to make a beverage known as pañuela tea. I'll put it differently. It's essentially warm sugar water. That's a broad way to put it, but you get the idea. So according to Chris Young's deposition, it took about 30 minutes to obtain the ingredients for this tea. That is, they had to go out and purchase the materials. It took another 30 or so minutes for them to prepare the ingredients, or rather prepare the tea itself and allow it to cool so that it could be administered to Brandon. At this point, he is apparently unable to drink this substance by himself. So they pour the tea into a squeezable bottle, one of those honey bears, and at this point, it is administered to Brandon, and immediately thereafter, Brandon then enters into his first alleged seizure. It lasts for more than 5 minutes, and 911 is promptly called. If you want to hear a portion of that 911 call, feel free to check out my YouTube channel. It is in my videos page. It's also linked below in the show notes for those who want to see. Just to be clear, in that 911 call, you will hear Chris Young saying that Brandon was turning blue. You will hear him say that they gave him sugar water because they thought he was a sugar diabetic, whatever that means. It's rather concerning to hear, so please do keep that in mind when you decide to listen to that 911 call. So, Chris Young calls 911. The ambulance arrives, and according to Brandon's father, Brandon then goes on to that ambulance as a John Doe. The way that this can be proven, or rather the evidence for it, is that Brandon's father was unable to find Brandon for a number of hours because of the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, Brandon went onto the back of that ambulance as a John Doe. When he arrived at the hospital, he was unidentified. So when Brandon's father was calling around to local Orlando-based hospitals, he was unable to certify whether or not Brandon was at any one particular hospital because, again, Brandon was unidentified. He drove all the way up to Florida Hospital East Orlando and happened to come to the right hospital. It was the closest one to SoulQuest, and was able to identify his son there. At the time, his son was unresponsive, and he wasn't able to say goodbye. And while Brandon was on that hospital bed, his father noticed that he had abrasions all over his body, abrasions so extensive that he personally told me that it was as if Brandon was thrown out of a moving vehicle. That is the way that Brandon's father described it to me. And I've seen the photos. That would be an accurate assessment. And once Brandon's father saw his son in that state that he was in, he knew something wasn't right. Mind you, immediately after Brandon got onto the ambulance, Chris Young gave Brandon's father a call. And according to Brandon's father, John Paul, he told me that there was John Paul told me that he immediately got the impression that something wasn't right and that there needed to be an investigation. Shortly thereafter, Brandon's father filed a wrongful death lawsuit in Orange County, Florida. And I've been following it since then. There's a lot that's going on in this case. It was just last week that there was another hearing that I attended. There's a trial set for March 2023. I plan on going. I plan on being there so I can report what happens. I'll be honest with my audience. This case has taken up so much of my time and energy and focus and emotional bandwidth that it's left me at a loss for words more times than I can count. Like I said earlier, even though more than 4 years have passed since Brandon's death, there have only been whispers of what happened on that Easter Sunday. And I've been doing what I can to raise awareness about what happened. I want to move on to perhaps the most pertinent topic related to Brandon. There is new evidence emerging that there is a contraindication between ayahuasca and kambo. These are two substances that are routinely administered within the same wellness retreats in the United States and abroad. If you look up the article about satanic ayahuasca in the show notes, you'll find a case of an individual who attended an Orlando-based ayahuasca retreat just this year, actually. And to be clear, I am in no way insinuating that this was SoulQuest. It was an Orlando-based ayahuasca retreat, just for the record. This individual had a history of diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol, and went to an ayahuasca retreat, partook of Ayahuasca and Kambo, and in the days following began experiencing hallucinations and seizures. And according to the doctors who looked over his case, it was found that he was suffering from a condition known as syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. And they found that essentially when ayahuasca and other psychedelics are used, especially in conjunction with other substances such as kambo, it can induce this condition, again known as syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion, also known as SIADH. This is an important topic because people's lives could be saved if people understand that it's extremely dangerous to combine ayahuasca and kambo within a short window of time of each other. As the article states, one common etiology of SIADH that is also of particular interest are medications. Studies have shown certain classes of antidepressants and recreational drugs, particularly monoamine oxidase inhibitors and MDMA, can cause SIADH in patients. Studies have shown active ingredients in ayahuasca, including DMT and MAOIs, have properties which, excuse me, I misspoke. They say in the paper that we theorize that due to this similarity in pharmacodynamic actions, ayahuasca overdose is potentially capable of also inducing SIADH in users. However, it is important to note that a limitation is the patient's use of kambo, poisonous secretions of giant leaf frog, in addition to ayahuasca. Use of kambo in rituals is usually accompanied by drinking large amounts of water. Also, kambo has a physiologic ability to alter normal hunger and thirst responses in individuals. Therefore, this can result in excessive drinking habits, potentially resulting in delusional hyponatremia. So, keep in mind that if you ever go to an ayahuasca retreat, it would indeed be dangerous to partake in kambo while you are there, especially if you are following the recommendation to abstain from a diet that is rich in salt. This is often encouraged in ayahuasca communities. Why exactly? I don't quite understand, but if somebody could provide information on that, I'd love to know. Now, just to be clear, Brandon Begley isn't the only person who's allegedly become victimized by the negligence of SoulQuest officials. Just 1 year before Brandon Begley attended SoulQuest, a Canadian citizen named Kevin Rupchand attended a 3-day, 2-night retreat at the Orlando church. At one point during the retreat, Chris Young and one Jayana Ashwar, allegedly offered Kevin Rupchand a substance known as katawa to help him, quote, resolve his issues. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's katawa? After countless hours of researching the ethnobotanical literature, Brian Pace and others, other colleagues of mine, helped me determine that katawa is likely the bark of either Schwarzia Katawa, or Hura crepitans. That's Swartzia Katawa, or Hura crepitans, Huracrepitans. Now, according to the available ethnobotanical literature, Katawa is utilized by South American shaman over the course of several months within their dietas. I can't offer much more information beyond that, so you'll have to forgive me. But you might be asking yourself why Mr. Rupchand was partaking of Katawa. Well, I'll read you a series of sentences from the lawsuit that Kevin Rupchand filed in Florida's courts. Quote, Katawa is a poison from a tree bark. It was suggested by Christopher Young and Diana Ashwar to help the plaintiff resolve his issues. It was administered for an additional charge of $50. The plaintiff was not advised that the Katawa was poisonous until after he consumed it. After consuming the Katawa, the plaintiff was then told he had to consume 10 to 15 gallons of water to dilute the poisons. The plaintiff then drank several gallons of water and had a seizure and lost consciousness. End quote. Lucky for Mr. Rupchand, he survived. He was hospitalized, and according to the allegations in the lawsuit, he, quote, suffered pain and mental anguish and permanent injury and disfigurement. 4 years after that Katawa ceremony, Mr. Rupchand finally filed a lawsuit with SoulQuest, and likely because of the publicity surrounding Brandon Begley, or at least rather the stories surrounding Brandon Begley and the Netflix special, he brought that lawsuit to Florida's courts, and Mr. Rupchand, he demanded a jury trial. The case went to mediation, and for better or for worse, the lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Those details are not available to the public. Now, before we wrap up this podcast, I want to share raw video footage of how one adverse drug reaction was actually handled at SoulQuest back in 2020. Remember that Netflix special I just mentioned? Well, back in 2020, camera crews were there, and they happened to witness an adverse drug reaction that occurred during an ayahuasca ceremony. The person in question, her name is Suzanne, and she described herself as a recovering alcoholic who overcame her addiction to ayahuasca through SoulQuest. And because YouTube is able to detect whenever I air copyrighted content, I have instead decided to provide those videos within the Google Drive link in the show notes below. That way, my entire audience can see for themselves in real time how SoulQuest handles an adverse drug reaction. If you decide to watch that video, please be advised that the content is rather graphic. Also, keep in mind that Suzanne did survive, so I am very happy for her in that regard. I'll leave it at that for now. Where do we go from here? To tell the truth, I honestly don't know. And I've been covering this story for 4 years, and I don't even know. There's so much more that I wanted to say in this podcast that I wasn't able to cram into the 2 hours that I was giving myself. But, I want to let it be known that I will be back soon for a third installment of this podcast series with an interview with Brandon's father and the Begley family attorney. There's still more to the story, as we all know. With the wrongful death trial happening in March, you can be rest assured that I'll keep our community up to date with everything that's going on in that regard. We've covered a lot today, and I want to thank everyone for sticking around. I want to thank everyone for their patience. And I want to do my best to end on a high note. And I can't think of a better way to do that than to share a quote from Brandon himself. Count your blessings and not your worries, and watch the magic unfold. I'll be back again soon, everyone. Thank you again to everyone who's tuned in to this podcast. Like I said before, if you feel that this podcast exceeded your expectations and you really enjoyed it, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and if you feel so compelled, please make a heartfelt donation to my podcast, Ultradelic. You can find that information in the show notes below. Until next time, everyone, take care.